It's so funny. It's not like I'm trying to show off. This is literally the only place in the house that is not a complete disaster zone. So.
I love it. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Lit Chick on a Mighty Blaze. You're catching us in the middle of a discussion of our bookshelves. Today, I have Beatriz Williams with me. I'm Jenna Paone. We're so excited to have you all join us today. And we're going to have a wonderful discussion about Beatriz's new book, Our Woman in Moscow. Beatriz, thank you for being here with us. How are you doing today? You've got it. How's it going? Congratulations on the release.
Well, thank you so much. It's going great. Again, we were just talking in the green room about how excited I am to hopefully get back out on the road and do a proper book tour again soon. We did have a lovely launch event, which was so joyful. I mean, everyone and all these leaders finally getting together and seeing each other. And so that was fabulous. And as I think as hard as this whole year has been for everybody, I think it's very joyful to get back out and talk to each other live.
I know it's especially fun that this is happening now in the summer, of course, understandably with the nice weather and everything. And until then, it's great. Oh, hello. We got readers from Washington, your home state. And yay, we've got people joining us from all over. So this is great. We're going to talk about Our Woman in Moscow. As always, folks who are joining us, if you want to leave some questions or comments for Beatriz in the chat, we'll try to get to them at the end. But right now, let's dive in with a little bit of backstory about Beatriz and her lovely new book. Beatriz Williams is the New York Times, USA Today, and internationally best-selling author of The Summer Wives, Her Last Flight, The Golden Hour, The Secret Life of Violet Grant, 100 Summers, and several other works of historical fiction, including 3 novels in collaboration with fellow best-selling authors Karen White and Lauren Willig. A graduate of Stanford University with an MBA in finance from Columbia University, Beatriz worked as a communications and corporate strategy consultant in New York and London before she turned her attention to writing novels that combine her passion for history with an obsessive devotion to voice and characterization. Beatriz's books have won numerous awards, have been translated into more than a dozen languages, and appear regularly in bestseller lists around the world. Born in Seattle, Washington, Beatriz now lives near the Connecticut shore with her husband and 4 children, where she divides her time between writing and laundry. Yes. Part romance, I love that part of your bio. I've always remembered that. And I'm like, now I get it. Now that I have a kid, I understand it. I'm like, oh yeah, this is accurate.
Exactly. It plays for laughs, but it's funny because it's true.
Yeah. It's not, it's like but kind of, yes. Part romance, part spy thriller, Beatriz's latest release, Our Woman in Moscow, is a gripping drama of Cold War espionage and family devotion that follows 2 sisters caught on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain. Our Woman in Moscow is an Indie Next pick for June, a Library Reads pick for June, an Apple Digital Audio Must Listen pick for June, a Best of Summer pick from Goodreads, Bustle, Pop Sugar, Frolic, BuzzFeed, She Reads, Real Simple, and more. And it's an inaugural book club pick for the new Peacock show, Booked. In a starred review of Our Woman in Moscow, Library Journal says Williams expertly shifts between family drama and a suspenseful espionage plot and makes every word and note count. And our guest last week, Ellen Hildebrand, says, I think Beatriz Williams is writing the best historical fiction out there. It's lush with period detail, but feels immediate. Beatriz, thank you for being here. Welcome and congratulations on Our Woman in Moscow. How's it going?
Thank you so much. It is going great. It's funny. We were just talking about how, this is kind of my first foray into the Cold War. And it was such a fascinating research journey for me and something that I just really connected with. I think partly because I grew up, in the shadow of the Cold War. I was born in 1972. I'm not afraid to say it. And, yes, a great year for strong women. We were all like latchkey, right?
So you really had a lot of influence over your writing because your writing is full of strong women. Can you tell us just a little bit more about Our Woman in Moscow, like the kind of the elevator pitch for it, and a little more about what inspired you to write this? Because it is a different, it's a little bit of a new undertaking for you.
Yeah. So, I've forgotten the elevator pitch at this point. I guess, and you obviously expressed it very well in the introduction. So it's really about, and it was inspired by this very fascinating true history of the Cambridge Spies, who were a group of young men who were in the 1930s, when capitalism was not in its finest moment, not its finest hour, and so a lot of young men and women were becoming very intrigued by the communist experiment taking place in the Soviet Union. So many of them joined the Communist Party in the 1930s, and at Cambridge, several of them were recruited by the Soviet spy service. Because they very cleverly realized that these young men were going to then go on to become leaders in government, leaders in intelligence gathering. And in fact, they were quite right. And for a couple of decades after that, until they were unmasked in the early 1950s, these men basically delivered some of our most vital secrets right to Stalin's desk.
Yay.
So, so that got me thinking about, betrayal. First of all, why do we passionately believe in certain things and cling to them despite, the growing evidence on the ground that communism in practice is in fact a totalitarian, by necessity, a totalitarian political system. So despite all this evidence, why do they keep believing in it? Why are they willing to betray their country for it? And then, of course, the question I always ask, what about the women? What are the women doing? Most of the histories of the Cambridge Spies, you get little bits and pieces, but do they know what's going on?
Yes.
Do they believe in it too? Are they objecting silently? Or are they helping them? Their husband spies. So I wanted to get into that, and I want to get into the psychology of it, the family drama, and to finally kind of wrap that into a spy thriller, a spy thriller format where you have a young woman who is married to an American who is spying for Stalin, ends up defecting with him behind the Iron Curtain. Her sister, her twin sister, who's been estranged from her all this time, gets a postcard in the mail and then heads off to Moscow to try and rescue her sister from behind the Iron Curtain. So that's kind of the nutshell, which I ended with instead of started with, but there we go.
I love it. No, I love it. It's so great. And, as always, your books always have a lot of action in them anyway. There's always a really, I think you write action very, very, very well. And it's always very impressive to me. So this is, sort of a natural evolution for you of kind of exploring these different types of stories of you've done Prohibition, you've done other time periods where there's a lot of high stakes stuff going on. And it's great to see you tackle another one. And especially, I was saying this to you in the green room before, but I feel like I learned so much about a time in history where, I feel like in history lessons, we kind of get to the 1950s and then it sort of stops, especially on your general history education through high school. And then, you take in college, you obviously can go in more depth, but it's such an interesting time period. The 50s in general is so interesting to me. Can you tell us a little bit about can you tell us about your research process and some of the resources you use and some of the cool things you discovered?
Yes. Oh gosh, this could take hours.
I know. I know.
May have been probably the most research intensive book I did, partly because even though I had quite a bit of just general knowledge of the 1950s from earlier books that I had, and just my general fascination with the whole 20th century and the transformation in our lives that took place decade by decade. So the 50s, I kind of had that background in it, but it was funny. It wasn't as if I was like, okay, what I really want to do is write a Cold War spy novel. It was more like, while researching something else, I came across some stuff about the Cambridge Spies, and I said, this is really something I feel like I need to write about, because there's just, we think of a Cold War spy novel and it's obviously very action packed and everything, and very male centric. Certainly. I mean, as much as I love John le Carré, not the writer of women characters, as he would have agreed himself. So I felt like there's a whole story there that isn't getting told, and that psychological story and that relationship story that's not told, the human story that really I really wanted to explore.
Yeah.
But there was also, and it's funny you said, these action scenes, certainly do not set out in a book to be like, okay, action scenes, the dialogue scenes to me are what I love to write. When I'm in my zone, because I'm writing a dialogue scene, and that's what I love, is that human relationships and how you tease that out with dialogue. action scenes for me, I mean, it's like choreography. It's all this choreography, and it's all got to be exact and precise, and it's got to happen. It's all got to happen just right, but as if it all happened by accident that way, you know? So you have to have the ability and yet the satisfaction of everything happening in the right way. And it's very, very hard. And it's not something every time I write something with a lot of action, I'm like, I'm never doing that again. My next the beach read of like, yet somehow I just keep getting sucked into these complex, you know, historical dramas that require this like suspense and action. So I know my editor's, you know, laughing at me yet again because I just turned in another. I was like, never again with this one. She's like, you just did it again, Beatriz.
So what do you think it is that brings you to that? Because that's such an interesting, because like I find action scenes to be really intimidating and really scary, and that, you know, like you said, that's that thing of I'd much rather write dialogue all day. I almost think of it more like a screenplay, you know, when I write, like, and you're saying, you know, dialogue particularly, and obviously you have so much fun with your dialogue. Your dialogue is always incredible. I love your witty one-liners, you know, everyone's so smart in your novels always. So do you approach, like, do you like have to psych yourself up into the action scene, or do you just kind of like tackle it?
Sometimes I wonder, not to get stereotypical, I sometimes wonder if sort of male authors have to psych themselves up to write dialogue scenes. You know? Not how these people talk to each other now, you know. And to me, if I'm watching a movie, I'm getting to the point where, like, if we, you know, if I have to go to some, you know, Marvel movie and we go to the 20-minute fight scene, I'm just like literally, I mean, it doesn't matter to me how whoever it is wins the fight, just who wins the fight. And we already know who's going to fight. But so to me, action scene, you know, it's got to have a purpose. It can't just be this gratuitous fighting. It's like sex scenes, you know, gratuitous sex is not boring, but it's not, you know, there's no problem. You know, if I got a sex scene in my book, it's because we need to know something about these two characters and their relationship. And if we put them in bed together, we can find something out, because certain things happen in bed that obviously don't happen anywhere else. I'm straying way off the whole research track here, but
that's okay. We'll go back to it. Talk about the books. Tell us what books
the reason why I'm attracted to that is because I kind of start with this simple idea about a human being in a certain situation. And I think I'm just getting to the point writing wise where I can't help complicating it, you know, and I can't help thinking, and then what happens 10 years down the road when he's this or she's that. And then, you know, and so I keep adding on these layers in my head. We end up with something more complex and more, you know, and then I'll be like, okay, I need to know a little bit about this historical aspect in order to tell that part of the story. And then I go and start reading about that. And then I'm like, oh my God, this is like so cool. And I really need to make this the heart of the story, you know? So the layers just kind of add on, you know, by themselves as I go through that research process. I think any writer of historical fiction will tell you that it's the stuff that you find out while you're researching something else that is what transforms your book into, you know, something really amazing. And it certainly happened with the book that I just finished, which is a bit of a follow-up to this one. So, you know, where you just keep going down all these rabbit holes, and at one point you just have to stop and say, but, you know, to me, the Cold War is so fascinating because there are so many layers and there are so many things we don't even know yet, because look, we can kind of access through freedom of information stuff that has happened on the US side. The problem is on the Russian side, you know, for a short time right after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism, the KGB opened its archives under Yeltsin. And then, surprise, surprise, under Putin, they closed them back up again. So we had a short window of research opportunity where we found out a bunch of stuff that really shocked us, like, you know, stuff that we didn't know, additional information about suspected spies. You know, we found out stuff about the Rosenbergs. We found out stuff about, you know, all kinds of things that surprised even people, you know, in our own intelligence services. So, you know, there's so much to find out. There's so many different layers. And behind all that, you also have this very existential struggle, because like I said before, you know, with World War II, we know, I mean, obviously the Nazis are the bad guys, and National Socialism is a terrible, terrible system. we're almost afraid to say, the thing about communism is it has a beautiful ideological idea behind it, which is that, we're all, we all sort of, live in this, from each according to his ability to each, according to his needs. It sounds so wonderful, but you have to have 100% population buy-in for this to work. You have one guy who's like, what are you talking about? I just worked my tush off and I get the same thing as that guy who sat on it the entire time. So, you have to have this 100% buy-in. And that necessarily requires that everybody believes, 100% of the population believes passionately the same thing. You cannot have any dissent whatsoever, which is what very early on communism discovered.
Right.
And so there is, it is okay to say that, hey, we were kind of doing the right thing. We often used unethical methods to get there. And we can argue that over and over, what we did wrong and right and how we should have gone about this. But the fact was, Stalin was just as much a psychopath as Hitler. I mean, the number of
monster
was just heartbreaking and horrible. And, and we shouldn't be afraid to say that what we were doing here was trying to stop him and to stop this from going on. And yes, it did go on to a much lesser extent, but under Khrushchev, there was still the repression, even though there was an opening up, there was still repression. So, it has got that wonderful, monumental, historical, importance to it. This is not, there's a certain ambiguity of moral purpose during prohibition. It's a little bit less good and evil, because you can argue whether prohibition was a good idea or a bad idea, and so on. But here you truly have a system that was creating enormous tragedy for human lives. And so there's just so much scope there for fiction and for this narrative story to get in there and tell that, in a fictional way, in a way that brings out the human side. Yeah.
And I found it, I said this to you in the green room before, but it's a really interesting book for times like we're living through, because it really is a discussion on a lot of levels about your adherence to ideology versus your adherence to other human beings. And we live in this very interesting time of the same sort of thing happening, of people clinging to their ideologies in every sort of area of the spectrum. And I always say it's not a line, it's a circle. And extremism especially is a circle, and
it meets at the bottom of the top.
It's at the bottom of the top on both in a lot of different ways. It's not a line. And I think it's a really interesting thing. How do you tackle these sort of philosophical issues in books like this? Like, how did you tackle it specifically in this book?
Well, so always when first and foremost, I'm telling a story. Yeah. I think that if you preach at people and if you tell them this is what I believe, you're going to lose half your audience right there, because the people who don't believe that particular, that particular, part of your system, and they're not going to buy into any of it.
Right.
Because we have gotten to a point where we're so absolutist about our beliefs. We're very us versus them. Yeah. It's a very religious thing where if you doubt a tenet of your faith, of your political faith, all of a sudden the whole thing might collapse. So you can't doubt anything. And this is for both sides, both left and right. I belong to the Patrick Henry school of like, I may completely disagree with what you have to say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it. I would fight for Marx. Marx is absolutely, no one's going to ban Marx. We need to read this. We need to understand this. But people now, and maybe, we can argue about how this came about. And certainly people have always felt very passionately about politics. But, I think that, and this is something that one of the characters says in the book, in the absence of it, religion has become a much less important part of people's lives.
Yes.
Human beings need to believe in something. We need to. There's a wonderful movie that I watched actually after I finished Our Women in Moscow. I think even the page proofs were done, so I couldn't change anything. And somebody had mentioned, my husband had come across this, so we watched this. It is called Dear Comrades, and I highly recommend.
Oh, yeah.
the Soviet stuff in here interesting. I highly recommend it. It's kind of art housey, and it's in Russian with subtitles. And it's about an uprising in the Khrushchev era. I think it was like 1960, 61. And it is devastating. And there's a couple of really, eerie parallels to some Russian characters in this book, including the name of the Russian woman who is sort of a party apparatchik, and anyway, has a daughter who is, anyway. So, and I sort of watch this going, oh my God, this is exactly it. And then she has this crisis at the end where she, her daughter has been eliminated by the Soviet services. And this is not a surprise. This is not a spoiler. And she says, if I don't believe in communism, what do I have left to believe in? And this is what's driven her passion, her adherence to communism, not as a political faith, as a substitute for a religious faith. And we all know what happens. Obviously the Crucible was written about the the McCarthy, the witch hunt, the communist witch hunt in the 1950s, which was obviously very wrong. People should not be persecuted for their belief. But it could just as easily have been written about, Stalin's show trials in the 1930s, So this happens on both sides where people are so passionate about their beliefs that they cannot admit any doubt. Not only that, but they cannot admit that the other person might have good intentions. That person is always going to be evil and wrong and bad so that you can be good. And, I, as a writer, as somebody whose job it is to take in this multiplicity of views and process them and see the humanity in everybody, because I think one of the things I try to bring out in both, my Soviet characters, my Soviet spy, my American Soviet spy is their humanity. They believe they're doing the right thing. They have good, and they're not psychopaths. They're not out there to kill people. They think they're doing the right thing, and they believe it is just as passionately as I believe we're doing the right thing when we go out and do the things we believe in. So
that is our job as writers, right? To discuss these complex characters and put characters in situations that maybe we would never be in our real life, but maybe there's a parallel that we can draw in our own life and maybe learn something or maybe think about how we would possibly do things. And that brings me to your characters are obviously so fabulous. All of your characters, but we have to talk about women because, that is your specialty. And I always have in my head, I kind of think of it as the Beatriz Williams woman, in my head, the most, in some ways, the best version of myself is somehow one of these women. It's the woman I would always want to play
Me too.
in a movie, right?
Yes, if you know my books and you've read all of them, I'm definitely more like Tiny than I am like any Vivian or or any of those. Vivian is who I would love to be if I had the nerve and didn't always want to please everybody. But exactly. But I did watch a lot of old movies especially in college. We had this great old movie palace, and they showed everything. Interestingly, not Ninochka. I've had a couple people say, "Oh, and I was like, wasn't that more of a kind of a romantic comedy?" I mean, but that's actually one thing I didn't see. So I need to go back and see Ninochka because some people have said, "Oh, Ninochka relations," but I'm like, actually, that's actually not one of the references for this book. But I do love. What I love about these characters is that, and it goes back to my grandmother, who she's British. She was born actually in Japan, grew up in Kobe, and then Calcutta, where she met my grandfather, and it's a long story. But she always used to say, and she's not a brash woman. She's not an expert, but she's definitely somebody who loves adventure and was very smart. And she used to say to me, the 20s and 30s were a wonderful time to be a woman. And it's the 50s when we fell asleep. And if you look at the movies at the time, if you look at the, the fiction of the time, women are really coming into their own, yet they're doing so in such a way that they're not trying to be men. They're just out there living their best lives and screwing up a lot, and making mistakes, but out there, trying things for the first time. And they do it in such the word that just popped into my head is stylish. They do it in a
stylish always.
They don't give anything up in order to, they just gain. And I love that. And I love their nerve and their moxie. And I love to write about when, and they're not all the same, you know, each one has a, you know, some come from, you know, happy families, some come from broken up families, some come from wealthy families, some come from not wealthy families. And that's all reflected in their interests and the way they talk and act. They're not sort of all this sort of cookie cutter female, but they do all share that sense of not letting life push them around. And I think that's something we can all relate to, you know, and so when one of my characters speaks, it's not necessarily my voice. That's always her voice. So you can't necessarily figure out what I'm really thinking about a character. It's what that character thinks about herself or about the people around her and what she's willing to share with you and not share with you. I'm just back there kind of like playing with my clay figures, you know, like, you know, seeing how they interact with each other. And you know, but I feel like that's really the best way to bring out ideas. You know, if I'm going to talk about a sensitive political subject, there's a scene in Our Women in Moscow where they're on this, it's like I actually took it from a real story of, you know, my real life inspiration for my Soviet spy, Sasha Digby, is this guy, Donald McLean, who's a British guy. And he had this sort of descent into alcoholism and despair because you know, of just the psychological toll of like spying, you know, on his own country and betraying his own friends. And there's this, he ends up as, I think, consul in the British consulate in Cairo. And there is this disastrous midnight picnic expedition along the Nile where somebody's leg does get broken. And it's literally like, you cannot make this up. So I pretty much just took it, you know, adapted it for my own purposes. But there's one point where, you know, they're like, they've come late to the boat and the tides are all wrong. So they're stuck on the sailboat off the Isle of Wight. And I have I deliberately brought some characters in who are very much oil and water. And they're kind of arguing with each other about, you know, communism versus, you know, Western democracy and liberalism. And, you know, and that's how I try to tease out these issues, you know, and to bring these characters and their ideas to life. And it doesn't mean that any one of those ideas are necessarily my own, but I feel like that dialogue is really the best way to bring that out and to get people to think about issues without demonizing or prejudging people based on what they believe and how that jives with your beliefs.
I love it. I love it. And you know, I mean, going back to the women a bit and this idea of the style. I love that you talked about your grandmother and her. Do you always kind of have her in mind when you write these women? Is that something like I love what you said about her being like an adventurer and not letting life get in your way. And, you know, you really do explore different ways of not letting life get the best of you, you know, like especially in Our Women of Moscow, Iris and Ruth approach things very differently. And, you know, the concept of femininity to both of them is very different. The concept of, you know, getting what you want and how you navigate. And I also do want to bring up Ludmilla, like, I mean, because
the officer.
Yes, without giving away anything, you know, she's a really fascinating character because, you know, she's extremely complicated. And yet she's a point of view character. Did you have any difficulty switching it all? And do you ever have difficulty? Because obviously you write in multiple POVs, always. Did you have any difficulty throughout this particular book switching between those three voices? And if so, what did you do to kind of...
When I first started writing multiple timelines / multiple point of view characters, it never occurred, and particularly because they were in different timelines. So it actually didn't occur to me to write it start to finish going back and forth. I always write one timeline first.
Okay. Do you write the first timeline, I assume? The past?
Yeah. So I write the first timeline. So for example, in the case of Our Women in Moscow, I first wrote Iris's story. And then I wrote, because I needed to know
what happened,
why Iris had gone to Moscow. What was her relationship with Sasha, her husband at that point? How did this relationship develop? Where are they when, Ruth is in Moscow? And then I layered in Ruth tracking her down and finding her. And then I was sort of halfway through Ruth's story when I was like, I really need to know what's in the head of the cat. Here's my mice, and I need to find out what my cat is thinking. But the other thing, as well as doing all this research on the history of the sort of the early 20th century history of the Soviet Union and how it became a country and leadership and all the events that are taking place. And I realized that just living through that, is going to be incredibly traumatizing. Yep. If you are somebody who, as Ludmilla is, we learn very quickly, and she relates this to us in a very dispassionate way, that her father had been a professor and had been taken off and denounced for having English novels, which was part of his job, but you couldn't do that because it was different ideas. And he had been taken off and killed. And then another one of her, and this is all based on like actual things that happened to actual people that I kind of just pieced together into one character. And then she had another brother who went to work for the predecessor to the KGB. It was called the NK. Well, okay. It went through many iterations. If you go to like the Wikipedia page for like the KGB, there's like 50 different permutations as it went through, and combined and separated with this and that organization, had different names. But for purposes of simplicity, we call the pre-war KGB the NKVD, and then the post-war the KGB, because it just makes it easier. So she had a brother who works in the NKVD, and as they did with many of them, he has an overseas posting, and then when he gets back, they kill him because he's been exposed to Western ideas. So, she's gone through all of this, family members dying, which she relates in a very dispassionate way, but that's only because that's how she deals with it. That's the only way you can deal with it. When everyone around you is getting denounced and taken to labor camps and executed in brutal ways, you have to just separate a war. And in fact, she says frequently, in 1952, that, she's a survivor. Yeah. And she really is. That is how she has survived, is by switching off her emotions. She's a survivor of profound trauma. I mean, the 1930s in the Soviet Union, 90% of the officer class in the army was executed because Stalin didn't trust anybody. I mean, the atmosphere of paranoia, where your best friend would denounce you, your husband, your wife would denounce you, your children would denounce you, parents would denounce their children. You cannot, there's no way to stay the degree of trauma that some of these people had endured. And so PTSD would certainly be the right way to describe Ludmilla in the events of this book, and how she's dealing with that is very interesting. Of course, she has a rebellious daughter. So how does she deal with that? Each one of these characters at some point betrays one of the other characters, sometimes several characters. And how we deal with that moral universe of betrayal, and how people internally deal with having betrayed or being betrayed, and how we get to that point of redemption. And can you redeem yourself? How do you redeem yourself? Will you allow yourself to admit that you are in need of redemption? That you've been wrong. So each one of these characters has to go through that and come to a literal point in the story where they have to make that choice for redemption, or to sort of cling to what they've always believed. So that is kind of the moral point of the story, the moral universe in which it exists. Of course, it is also spies and chasing and lots of excitement, and there's some romance in there. But it is actually a very deeply moral book, and it is about the moral choices we make and how we come to terms with them, and how we redeem ourselves.
I love it. So on that, so then let's switch gears a little bit, because you brought up romance, and I have to say, we have to talk, because there's always such great, you are such a great writer of romance. I remember the first book of yours I ever read was 100 Summers. And I remember thinking that you were one of the few writers who, in my mind, kind of really captures falling in love in like a way that it's the best possible iteration of it, and it's the love that you feel, in that heady thing, but it's it's that like falling totally head over heels in love. Like I feel like I fall in love when I read your books again, which is like, it's like very addicting. It's like one of my favorite things about your books, because you don't often get to feel that again. You know, like if you're like me and you're, you know, I'm married and I love my husband, with like, you know, we're together, but like, you know, you get to go back to that first moment of meeting and falling in love through your books, which I love. Yes. Margaret is commenting Serotonin Central, and that's like totally what your books are. How do you approach romance? How do you approach building relationships of a romantic nature in, you know, in your books?
I am really glad you asked me that, because I sometimes go through this crisis. Like, maybe if I didn't have a love story in my book, the New York Times would review me, you know, maybe, you know, but then I think, you know, who cares what the sort of aesthetic viewpoint of the New York Times is? I care about writing books that my readers will, you know, not just, you know, have that experience again of falling in love, which I love. You know, I grew up reading sort of 19th century English literature, because my father's British, and so this is what was stocked in our house. So to me, you know, that you know, the falling in love, whether male, female, whatever, is and finding somebody where you have not just, you know, it would be lovely to have that lovely heady experience of falling in love, but also to build an enduring relationship of trust with that person, is the project of our lives. I mean, think how important it is to like have the right life partner, you know, and like to say, oh, we don't need a man, but you know, whether you are in a, you know, heterosexual relationship, homosexual relationship, whatever it is, finding that partner who understands you is, I mean, is kind of our life project, isn't it? To connect with other people. And so to me, it's vital and it's important. And it's, you know, it's very hard to write a book that does not have some element of that, because it is so much a part of our natures. Look, I was an anthropology major, right? Which my parents were obviously very proud. But it turns out that it's actually a great background for writing books. Write books about people. And so much of who we are, behaviorally, emotionally, physically, is because, look, let's face it, you know, the job of life is to create life. You know, we're here on this planet, biologically speaking, you know, if it's just nature who's like telling us what to do, we're here to reproduce our DNA so that our DNA will be the DNA that goes on to the next generation, right? So much of what we do and think, even if we're not aware of it, has some element of that reproductive, you know, imperative to it. You know, and finding the right person to, you know, have a child with and raise a child with, is, you know, is part of our the instructions in ourselves, right? And to leave that out, and to leave out the emotional aspect of that sometimes gets reinterpreted as, oh, it's sentimentality. It's not. It's vital. Who we are. Sentiment drives us, right? And you know, to sort of say that this is, oh, that's kind of the women's stuff, you know, that's like women's fiction. That's just like the relationship stuff that is not, you know.
That's why we do these interviews, because we live in a patriarchal society that discounts anything that has feelings,
you know, and so to me, it's just so vital, and to explore the different ways in which we can fall in love, and the different people with whom we can fall in love, and what makes a relationship work and not work, and all those things, you know. My book, if you, for example, just the relationship between, you know, Sasha and Iris, you know, is a deeply passionate love affair in the beginning, and as you know, they both sort of deteriorate under the weight of what Sasha's doing. You know, I kind of meticulously track that. And yet, even when she kind of hates him at one point, they still have this sexual attraction to each other, you know, and so there's layers, so many layers in there. So, you know, when you throw a sex scene in there, or you throw a love affair in there, you are absolutely running the risk of not being taken seriously. I think, oh, this is just fun stuff, it's just there to like titillate, but it's actually vital, and it's happy or not happy in life. And, my book last year, Her Last Flight, we have a woman, and this is where I sort of explore how our relationships as when we're young and form, the relationships we form when we're older. And gosh, she's definitely, the one of the main characters in that book was, she went through, I really put her through hell, and just her background and what she does, and how behaviorally she reacts to all this trauma that had happened to her when she was young, and it's just so important. And there's just all these sort of layers that I kind of hide behind all the, the fun stuff, but it's really about the important stuff. And maybe one day we'll get to the point where that gets a little more the respect I think that it deserves. I think there's just so many great women's fiction books out there that
I couldn't agree with you more. I don't know why, like, I don't understand why talking about these very important things that every person looks for, whether you're male, female, non-binary, like everybody, like is looking for connection with other people. And that's, I don't understand what is less serious about that somehow.
I have a whole long thing about that.
We could have.
One of the reasons why I'm so fascinated by the 20th century is because we start out the 20th century under the sort of the spell of the capital R romanticism of the 19th century. And then the trauma that's inflicted on us by all the isms of, of the 20th century has this effect of, anything with an optimistic ending or an optimistic view of nature or an optimistic view of love or of, it just all gets kind of washed under this sentimentality thing when it's not, and, I like the word melodrama. That is a word I really hate because it's like, that's usually a man's way of dismissing things that are important to women. So whenever I see the word melodrama, I'm just like, it's usually a man like talking about a woman's work or a work that's about women, like Puccini gets constantly, I'm a big opera fan, Puccini gets dismissed constantly. Oh, his works are just melodramas. Tosca is the kick-assest woman ever, she really is, and to dismiss that as sort of melodrama is to dismiss the fact that women are constantly, we're just
valid and interesting.
That's like, how do I defend myself, and this is not melodrama. This is like real life. And, and what really happens to us, and just because we're not, with swords fighting people, does it mean that it's not drama,
Although your women, sometimes I could picture your women having swords and fighting too, but I like that we get the women that like totally can, do that as well with you, which I just, again, I go back to my Beatriz Williams woman, like someday, like when I, like the best version of myself is a Beatriz Williams woman in like a devastating red dress and like super high heels who just says something very witty and like walks away holding the martini and the cigarette and is just like, okay, like goodbye.
Exactly that. You always get the best last word. That's one of the reasons I brought Aunt Vivian on board that sailboat scene that I was talking about. Is she is someone who will like deliver it and tell you, and I think she has this line where she's telling Sasha, look, you're like the guy who combs his last remaining hair over his head and tells himself he's not bald. And I'm like, why can't I ever think of that when I'm at a cocktail party, right?
But hey, at least you got to write it, and that's right. We when we have a moment to think, we do it. Like it's great. And on Vivian, which I have to point out, those of you who have been watching the interviews, you're our third author in a row who has had a central character with the name Vivian, and I named my daughter Vivian my daughter was born this past October, so I feel like it's a very special like little blessing from like my favorite authors that like everybody's got a Vivian this year, which I love. love.
No, mine goes back.
I know yours goes back this way. I want to talk
first with Secret Life of Violet Grant.
Life of Violet Grant, and that actually is one of the first. I tucked that name in the back of my head because I loved your character. I loved Vivi so much in the book, and I was like, if I ever have a daughter, I want her to be like this. And I tucked that name in the back of my mind, and I thought about it as we were thinking about names for. I wanted her to have a real, grand dame kind of name.
Yes, I love these older names. They're older, but they're not, they're still not mainstream yet.
Yeah, they're spunky, but they're still they're elegant and sophisticated too. Let's talk about the Schylers, because you have just Our Woman in Moscow, like so many of your books, touches on the Skyler family. And I just love this, that you do this in your work as a whole. That you kind of bring us into this. For those of you who might not know, I think all of you are very familiar with Beatriz's work who are watching. That's why you're here. But you have this very complex blue-blooded family and all the different offshoots of this family that all your books kind of touch on. And I'm so interested to know, did you originally decide that, when you started writing, were you like, I am going to write all of my books with and have little touch points of this one family, or did that happen naturally? That happened over time
in a very organic way. It's actually Skyler. It's the Dutch.
Skyler. Sorry,
I know. It's Skyler. I was my two passions growing up were opera and horse racing, and growing up on the West Coast, I didn't know how any of these old New York names. So there was all these Dutch names were pronounced. So I was like the Stuyvesant Handicap and the Scalurville Stakes. And so now, but I quickly got schooled, in New York about, the best pronunciation. But anyway, so and it was fine. This was before Hamilton, came out. But I deliberately picked the name Skyler because it is an old New York Dutch, and if you have a Dutch name in New York, it means it goes way back to pre-colonial days. So I wanted an old family, and this is when I was writing 100 Summers. So my character, her mother and her father both come from old New York families, but her mother in particular comes from an old New York family, and that's when I created her. She's just her maiden name was Skyler, and then I had to kind of throw in the aunt. I actually think I may have been recently. My mother-in-law is a big old movie fan as well, and I think I'd recently been watching Auntie Mame. And so I was like, I need an aunt like that in one of my books. So I threw in, but I actually based it on a real life aunt of my mother-in-law. Aunt Julie was her last name was actually Domrick. So which is a name that also appears in one of my books later. But she really was, like a one name, person in the society columns back then. Julie Weds, was the headline when she got married. And if you've read The Forgotten Room, which is the book that I co-wrote with, the first one that I co-wrote with Karen White and Lauren Willig, it takes place in this great big double-fronted house on, I think it's East 69th Street. Well, that was the actual mansion that Aunt Julie grew up in.
Love it.
We used to sneak out to date, Apparently Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb was actually married at the time.
Really?
But she was such a vibrant character. She was a side character, but she was what they call a truth teller.
Yeah.
And this, I read something many, many years ago about the satisfaction you get from the truth teller character, the one who tells what it is, who reveals all. Sometimes, for example, Emilia at the end of Othello, where she's the one who says, "You trusted Iago? Why did you realize who Iago is and what he's done? And that handkerchief was mine. The handkerchief she gave me, he took it from me." And there's this moment where all is revealed by the truth teller, Emilia. And so I love having that character in a book who tells it like it is, who tells the characters how screwed up they are, how messed up they are, but who's also a bit of a secret keeper, right? She's kind of the family secret keeper as well. So when I went to write The Secret Life of Violet Grant, which is also based on a real life story in my my husband's brother's family, I was like, oh, I got to put Aunt Julie back in there. So maybe this is about the Skylers. Maybe there's more Skylers, and it's kind of built from there. Where Vivian has two sisters, and I was like, I wrote like one line about Tiny, and I'm like, oh my God, the next book is about Tiny because Tiny is hiding a big secret. I know she is. And then of course I couldn't do two sisters and not three. So we ended up telling Pepper's story as well.
Love Pepper so much.
And this is how I built. So now, and I've nearly done, I apologize to those of you who've been waiting for the Skyler family tree to be updated on my website.
Yep.
I had a technical difficulty because I was using, Microsoft Word. They have a smart art function for hierarchies. So that was what I did the original family tree on. And I went to expand it. And that's when I figured out how patriarchal, the smart art thing is, because you can't just do like a white with another brand. There's only one patriarch, possible, unless somebody can tell me how else did I tried for a day. You can't have a two patriarch tree.
Well, if that isn't like, the crux of everything.
Your daughters are going to computer science and fix this problem. But anyway, so I've literally had to create it myself with text boxes and lines. And I'm telling you, my eyes right now are like bugging out of my head, but it'll be done, and it'll be done shortly. And the best thing is I'll be able to, update it, because it will require updating when The Wicked Widow comes out.
I was going to say, can we hear a little bit about what's next for you and what's on the docket?
So The Wicked Widow, so I started this Wicked City series with maybe my favorite character to write ever, Jen Kelly. She is Appalachian, and comes to New York City in the middle of Prohibition and gets herself involved in this whole, liquor racket, and bringing down this liquor racket that it turns out her stepfather is connected to. And then it's juxtaposed with a story that takes place in Manhattan in the same apartment in 1998 and involves this guy.
Yep.
So I wrote this book, and I just love this character so much. But then my editor's like, we were trying to do 2 books a year for you for a while, and we can't get the marketing sort of, for 2 hardcovers a year. Nope. So Wicked Redhead came out as a trade paperback a few years later, and I just dropped The Wicked Widow on my editor's lap in November. I was like, so the past few months I've been writing the 3rd book in the series, and here it is. And she said, well, I will certainly try to get this out by autumn. And she did. It'll be out the end of October. We went around and around with some titles and ended up with The Wicked Widow, which has some people a little worried about what happens in the book, to which I say, maybe you're right, maybe you're not. But our Wicked Widow is Jin. It might be, but there are a couple of other widows who could possibly qualify as wicked in this book as well. So don't necessarily assume. It was a cathartic book for me to write. Like all of you, I went through 2020 in a state of shock. And it was very difficult. I came out with Her Last Flight last summer, and I loved that book so passionately. And it got very buried in everything that was going on that summer. And it was certainly not the time for me to be out there, talking about my wonderful book all the time. So I felt like I was really kind of depressed about that, because I felt like I really wanted to get out there and talk about this book and this book that I love so much. And so I ended up, was like, the only thing I can do about this is I can write another book and just pour everything into it. So The Wicked Widow is a very intense read, and it is an intense read even after I cut out a bunch of stuff that my editor was like, you went a little too far there, honey. You need to, your readers, this is a little much. And I was like, maybe you're right. I was a little, I was a little out of my head a few times there.
2020 was a year of extreme.
I a few scenes back a bit, and all that. And but it is very intense, and definitely some bad things happen. But it's a book that's very much about morality. It definitely tries to find some anchor in this peculiar moral universe of the 20th century. And so some bad things definitely happen, but also some good things happen. So don't be too scared away. And anyway, you do have to read and find out who the wicked widow is, and it was the husband that dies.
I love it. Beatrice, real quick, how do you keep up the pace? How do you keep the ideas flowing? Do you dive right into the next book as soon as you finished?
So, yes. So there's two answers to that. Number one is I have so many ideas in my head, and I do have books I want to write, and I am truly happy. I am not all that happy on social media. As much as I love interacting with people, I'm very private, as you know. You don't see a lot of posts about, my kids and so on.
Yep.
And all those other things. I kind of just talk about my books and history, and that's what I'm really most comfortable sharing to the wide world. And so I don't enjoy that as much. I don't have a huge circle of friends. I like to have the people I trust to keep them close. So what I do is write. I take care of my family, and I write, and writing is my happy place, and it's where I go to be happy, even though sometimes it's a lot more challenging than other days. But so I love to write. So that's number one. Number two is that I have 4 kids, and for the past, I guess, at least 10 years, I've been the breadwinner. Yep. So partly because I have to write, I got to put food on the table. So it'd be like, oh, my muse is just like not visiting. I'll spend the day on Twitter instead. I can't do that. I mean, I have and I got to finish it, and it's got to be out there, and I need to, get paid for it. So, so it's not like I don't write these with all the love and passion of which I am capable. But I think having that need to, support literally my 2 oldest are now in, of course, private college, because that's what they had to go to. And so, the pressure is really on. And so, I do this because I love it. There's literally no other job I could do this. But on the other hand, I also, it does give me a discipline where I can't just sit back and relax and phone in the next book, and maybe, people said, oh, it's like each book, there's not a bad egg, I'm like, because I can't afford to, I can't afford to just sit back and relax and phone in a book, every book, not just because I love what I do, but because each book I'm like, well, maybe this will be the massive runaway bestseller, that will, so, I keep writing because I don't just have to write for myself, because I love what I do, and I love bringing these characters to life. But it is also what I do for work. So.
I love it. We had a great question a little while ago from Anissa, who said, "What are you most proud of as an author?"
Sorry, you went out.
The question was, "What are you most proud of as an author?" Which I think is a great place to end.
I think what I just said, that I think that, and I do have kind of favorites, just because, there are certain characters you connect with a little more than others. But I think that the thing I am most proud of is that each book I have brought out to my readers is the best book that it could be. Yep. And I, despite having these moments of crisis where I'm like, well, maybe I should do something that would please the literary types a little more. But I think I always focus on my readers, and stories that my readers will connect with, because I connect with them too. So I think that just that integrity is the thing that I am most proud of. And I don't shy away from complex things at all. I don't write down to my readers at all. I got an email yesterday from someone saying, I'm really confused by our woman in Moscow. Who was the spy at the end? I'm like, I'm just not going to explain it to you. I think it's fairly clear by the end of the book. But I do expect my readers to bring their thinking caps, and put them on when they read my books. I try not, I guess my point to sort of, bring this to a close is just, I write every book, with total respect for my readers, and to treat them with my writing as I would expect to be treated as a reader.
I love it. I mean, I honestly can't think of a more accurate statement, like hearing you say that, like the experience that I get as a reader, like I want to just tell you is that like what you're shooting for is what I get from your books as a reader. I know that when I open your book, I am in for not only entertainment and joy and, you know, all of these wonderful things, but it's that elevated, you know, your work is elevated on everything from a construction level to even a sentence level of just the writing is so good. The story construction is so good. The characters are so good. I do feel that it's an enjoyable intellectual exercise as well as fun. So just so you know, that's like my experience as a reader.
Literally exactly what I aim for with every book. And I think you will agree with me that it can be challenging, I think, as a woman to navigate that sense of, well, what should I write?
Yep.
Versus what do I want to write versus, you know, what is my purpose in writing?
Yep.
And to hear that from you, I think is just like, oh my God, it's total validation. I'm like, okay, good. You know, so I was, you know,
I'm glad because it's not like, it's only because you said that exactly like that, you know, I mean, I would have thought that anyway, but like, it's interesting when you hear people say what they're going for, like you're getting it. Like I want to let you know you're getting it. At least from this reader.
Each sentence of mine, you know, that I put in there is it has a purpose to it. And to hear you say that is just, it's like, it's everything. It truly is. So thank you to you, but also all the wonderful readers who have given me such amazing feedback for this.
Yes, thank you to you for writing these beautiful books, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. This was a great discussion. Please go out and read Our Woman in Moscow, and hopefully buy it from an indie bookstore. Beatrice, do you have any bookstores that you want to give a shout out to?
Well, I guess there's my locals. You know, Bank Square Books has been a tremendous supporter, and I do. They have a ton of my signed books right now, and I can also personalize them. They get a hold of me every so often and say, we have a few books for you to personalize, so I can head over there very easily. They're in Mystic, always a pleasure visiting Mystic. So yes, so I'm like, oh, sure, I'll come down. Also, RJ Julia in Madison, I have some signed books there, and they are amazing in the ship and so on. And there's several bookstores that I visit frequently. I haven't been able to visit because of the
We'll get you there.
Foxtail outside of Atlanta is terrific, and Poison Pen out in Scottsdale. I cannot wait to go back and visit them, partly because the Valley Ho Hotel is like one of my favorite places.
Yes.
This is like a hotel that should be in a Beatrice novel. It's like a total like Mad Men. It's fantastic. You're gonna have to get it in one day. I love it, and we'll be on the lookout for The Wicked Widow. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to Julie Gerstenblatt for producing, and to Alex Hoops and Amanda Smiley for helping with our social media. I've been forgetting to thank them at the end of my interviews lately, and I need to just say thank you, because every week they're here making things happen and doing everything behind the scenes. I'm Jenna Paone. Thank you for joining us on Lit Chick on A Mighty Blaze. Next week, I believe we have Amy Mason Doan, and we're excited to talk to her. We're going Peace and Love, Summer of Love next summer. So next week. So thank you all. Thank you, Beatrice, again. And we'll see you guys again next Friday.